So hello everybody, thank you for joining this. I'm delighted to be here to tell you a little bit about the Latin Now project hosted by the University of Nottingham. Latin Now is short for the Latinisation of the northwestern Roman provinces, and it depends for its success on an amazing team of individuals. The core team you can see on this slide here, and the postdocs who are from all over the world, the technical director who's based in Los Angeles, and our senior scientists. But we are also dependent on the admin staff at the university, on colleagues across museums in Europe, and we're also dependent on colleagues that are willing to share their data with us, because as you will see later on, we use a huge amount of data. We haven't finished our project yet, so the project actually runs until 2023. So I'm hoping that I might be invited back in 2023 to tell you all about our final conclusions. So this is going to be much more introductory. I've only got 20 minutes. So I'll tell you a little bit about our research questions. I'll zoom into one of our provinces, and hopefully this will give you a flavour of some of our conclusions. So I'd like to transport us first to Tabard Square in Southwark in London in the 2nd century CE. So you're standing in front of an altar, looking out towards the Thames in front of a Romano-Celtic temple. You can probably smell the burning of the offerings in the air, and you can probably hear some animals, the crows in the sky and the poor animals that are about to be slaughtered behind you. And you can probably also hear snippets of conversations going on around you. There's a group of snappily dressed togaed guys up by the altar, speaking in a rather posh variety of Latin, switching into Greek now and again because they don't want some other people to understand their in-group language. There's also a bunch of older guys up by the altar who are not very impressed about the use of Latin in this sacred space. They're only keen for British Celtic to be spoken. Over in the corner, there's some children running around. They're switching happily between Latin and British Celtic. And there's a few traders who are having conversations. One's called Barates. He's from Palmyra in central Syria, and he's on his way up to Hadrian's Wall. And with him is his new wife, Regina, from the tribe of the Catalani. She speaks mainly British Celtic, and she's struggling to understand Barates, who speaks his first language is Palmyran, his second is Greek, and his third is Latin. Now, where on earth was I getting all of that from? Well, from our research in the Latin Now project, which is based on a mixture of things, including epigraphic evidence, which is writing on stuff from the ancient world. And we happen to have a piece of written evidence from Southwark in London to tell us a bit more about one of the possible people who might have been standing in the 2nd century CE in front of that altar, making, in fact, the dedication of this inscription that we see before us. So it's dedicated to the divinities of the Augusti and the god Mars Camillus. Mars Camillus is interesting, of course, because that's a Roman name plus a local one. And this guy, Tiberinus Calerianus, is a citizen of the Bellovaci, which is modern Beauvais in France. What's really cool is the bit that I've boxed in blue, Moritix Londiniensium. Londiniensium is interesting because it's the first time the Londoners appear on the historical stage in a piece of epigraphy. But Moritix is probably even more interesting. Unfortunately, I can't ask you what you think it says, but it's not Latin. It's a Latin inscription, and this is not a Latin word. If you go to a dictionary, you will not find Moritix therein. It occurs actually only twice in the ancient world, here and in Cologne. So what is it? Well, it's Celtic. And we can split it up into sea and stepper or walker. It means some kind of sea traveller, perhaps a sea merchant, perhaps equivalent to Latin nauta. So on the continent, this guy living in Beauvais in France is going to be have, perhaps as one of his languages, the Celtic language of that area, which is Gaulish. And in Britain, they also speak a Celtic language, British Celtic. And the two languages in this period are very similar. So he's perhaps picking a term here for this inscription that resonates with local communities, the kind of communities he's probably trading with. And this point leads me to an important part of what we do in Latin now. We're not just about Latin. It's so important to us to understand the local communities, the languages and the cultures under Rome. So we strive to understand the Paleo-European languages, so what's happening before and the languages that are still spoken during Rome in some areas. And then also we look forward to what happens next, the after Rome period, because that can tell us a little bit about just how successful or not Latin had been in certain areas over the Roman period. And I think we are a little bit unusual in our team in assembling specialisms in a range of Paleo-Hispanic and Celtic languages, because Romanists don't tend to necessarily know languages beyond the classical ones. And I think it's really important to give us a different dimension into understanding life in this part of the world in this period. So what are our main questions and our main research streams? So we are interested in this big linguistic and cultural change. So in the Iron Age, there was a patchwork of local languages, as we've just seen on one of those maps. And by the end of the Roman period, this had been substantially reconfigured. So we want to know why this is happening, how this is happening, where it's happening, when does it start, how long does it last, how successful is it, who exactly is speaking these new languages, and why are people not in some cases. And we want to correlate what we understand about this linguistic and cultural change with other social variables, other social practices. And the third point here is also quite important, because I hesitated before using the term Latinization in the name of this project, because I didn't want people to think it was all about Latin. And Latin itself, it should be said, is extremely various. So Latin over this area will look very different depending on whether you're in southern Spain or northern Britain. And that's partly because of the contact languages with which it's coming into contact. So we're interested in all the variety of Latin, in bi and multilingualism that is created through the uptake of Latin, and in the fate of these local languages, which ones survive, which ones don't. And in doing all of this, as you've probably noticed, a lot of our evidence is through the written context. So we're interested in these contexts for literacy, and we're not really interested in the ongoing debate about sort of what percentage of people in various provinces are literate and illiterate. We're not interested in trying to reach numbers, which is sort of ultimately quite futile, I think. What we're interested in is literacy and people, a sort of socio-literacy, the context for literacy. So we're interested in socio-literacy in the way that we're interested in sociolinguistics rather than linguistics. So how do we do this? How do we answer these research questions? Well, we have to be highly interdisciplinary. So that means we're using the evidence, the approaches, the perspectives from a range of different disciplines and combining them. So we're combining sociolinguistics, particularly by multilingualism studies, epigraphy, so that's the writing on stuff, and archaeology to write a social history of this part of the world with a specific focus on language. Now, at the heart of all of this is a complex nexus that is part of our shared human past and present. That is the complex nexus of language, identities and cultures. And that nexus we come back to constantly in the project to rethink and try to understand more deeply what might be going on. It is not the case, for example, that if you find a Celtic name in an inscription, that this automatically means some kind of Celtic ethnic identity. It's much, much more complicated than that. And sometimes our evidence is just really, really difficult, and it resists any attempt to kind of categorize it neatly in terms of the concepts of bilingualism that we've traditionally used. And modern sociolinguistics is helping us to make sense of some of this messiness. So modern sociolinguists are currently talking a lot about translingualism and translanguaging, and reminding us that it's not all about languages with a capital L, and that linguistic resources can be rather fluid. and that people don't necessarily carve up their linguistic repertoires into strict, this is one language and this is another. And this helps us to think about messy evidence like the spindle whales from Eastern Gaul, which are really mixed in terms of their language. And some of them you just simply can't separate the words into different languages, because at the same time they are both referencing both Latin and the Celtic language Gaulish. So translingualism is helping us to think more fluidly about the languages and to understand that we sometimes bring our knowledge of languages and nation states to our material, which is a sort of anachronistic thing to do. So let's focus in now on Britannia, on Roman Britain, and some of the things we're doing with languages and literacy in one of our provinces. And I really enjoy working on Roman Britain, partly because our evidence for it is so wonderful, and that's in part because of our technical director, Scott Vanderbilt's work. He has been putting online all the inscriptions from Roman Britain on the Roman Inscriptions of Britain.org, which was revamped and expanded and relaunched in 2019. Now, what you don't see when you use this website, which has large numbers of inscriptions now on it, including all the Vindolanda tablets, the Bloomberg tablets from the City of London, and 2 of the RIB volumes, is that behind the scenes, we've been encoding copious metadata in Epidoc, which allows, when you're online, you to do very advanced searching, but it also allows us to do detailed analysis, because we can encode all kind of features about names, about social linguistics and all sorts. And when we do this across the whole provinces, you can see that we can start to do really detailed analysis that you can't do without the digital tools. In addition to sort of working with digital versions of existing resources, we're also adding new readings of old material. So scattered in museums across Europe, there are stylus tablets and other things that we know are there, but nobody's read them because they're very, very hard to read with the naked eye. And by using modern techniques such as reflectance transformation imaging, we're able to recover some of these ancient texts that have previously not been read. So, for example, in summer 2019, we were able to work with the British Museum and the Vindolanda Trust to look at their couple of hundred unpublished stylus tablets, which have traces of writing on them. And then, of course, we read them, and then we will publish them in print and also online. Now, Britain is great because of a systematic publication of all kinds of material, including the really scrappy stuff. We've got great information for sociolinguistics, but it's not the whole picture. And one way that we can complement our picture beyond the epigraphy is by using writing equipment. So this is archaeological evidence for literacy and for language. And this is something that has not normally been integrated into analyses by epigraphers and linguists, but it's really important addition to our ability to understand these practices. So writing equipment, on the whole, when you find it, chances are it was used for writing. There are some instances in literary sources where it's used to poke elephants and to kill people, but on the whole, if you find writing equipment, chances are it was used for writing. So it can be used as a proxy for literacy, used with care, of course. But also for somewhere like Britain and some of our other provinces, but not all of them, it can also be used as a proxy for Latinization, because when you're writing in Britain, 99.9 times out of 100, you're writing Latin. And what's great about our resources for Britannia is we have national scale data sets from the Portable Antiquities Scheme and from Rural Settlement in Roman Britain project, which allow us to have useful data on this matter that we can coordinate with our other sources of data. That's not unfortunately the case for all our other provinces, where we don't have the same kind of national level data sets, but great work has been done on various urban centres such as Augst or Merida, or regions such as Catalonia. And one of the things we've been doing in our project is trying to coordinate some of this evidence and also to write guides to help people identify catalogue and understand how to use this writing equipment. So Anna Villi, one of the postdocs, is about to publish a book, volume 2 of the Manual of Roman Everyday Writing that we've been working on, which is entirely devoted to writing equipment. So those are some of the resources that we're working with for Britain, and that is scaled up when we get to a provincial level. We have similar type resources from all over our provinces, and we have in our project database 2 main sets of evidence. We have the epigraphic side of things, that's with the big E up there, which is largely from the Europeana Eagle project, nearly 200,000 files from them, which we've supplemented with Gaulish inscriptions, Rhitic, Noric, all sorts of other things, and help from the Hesperia project on that with thanks. We've been cleaning it, deduplicating it, adding sociolinguistic data, all in Epidoc format, and that forms our epigraphic core. And then we also have our non-epigraphic data core, that's the writing equipment that I've just described, settlement information, road information, production centre information, all sorts of things like that. Then we can visualise all of that in our project, GIS, and we can use that to interrogate patterns. So what we end up doing is trying to manipulate constantly different scales of analysis. The big picture, which might be the whole of the Western provinces or an individual province, right down to the very local, which might be a farmstead or an individual. And we've constantly got to keep these scales of analysis in play in our analysis. And one of the key things we are learning how to do all the time is how to read the gaps. We do that all the time as ancient historians. And it's really, really important for a project like this that is so big, because we need to question all the time when we find gaps in our data, is this a gap that in any way represents any kind of ancient realities, or is it gaps that are born out of the result of differences in the survival of evidence, archaeological and publication practices. So learning how to read the gaps is really important. And we find ourselves talking about complexity all the time. The entanglements of all these communities, the multiple identities that people have create discrepant experiences that mean that every community, every person in the ancient world has a different experience. And we're exploring how to understand this complexity through this project. And what we're seeing is really marked regional specificities. It's only through a project of this kind of scale that we can really see them in their full glory, because we are dealing with these different scales of analysis. So right at the beginning of the project, in fact, when I was writing the proposal for the project, I put forward various social factors that I thought would be important for Latinization, based on my knowledge of the ancient world, but also on the spread of lingua francas in the modern world also, or in other ancient situations. And it is the case, frankly, that we haven't added to those factors, but we have added a lot of flesh to the bones of those social factors that I was putting forward. And again, it's the regional specificities that come through constantly. So one aspect that we thought would be important was urbanism, that cities would be important players in the spread of Latin. And of course, that turns out to be the case, but it's a lot more complicated than just a basic urban-rural divide, with urban more Latin and literate and the rural illiterate and non-Latin. Rural, for example, is a way too basic term for what's going on in the countryside, because we have villas, we have production centres, we have mansio, and all of these things create centres of Latinization in some sense, in some places. So the urban-rural divide is really too stark. And somewhere like Britain, for example, we can see that the area of the Chilterns and the Cotswolds, for example, seems to be much more literate than other parts of the southeast even. And when we turn, for example, to the Iberian Peninsula, we see quite big differences in the power of cities. So some cities seem to draw people in and to be highly engaged in the epigraphic habit and literacy, but the surrounding countryside is not. But in other parts of the Iberian Peninsula, the literacy and the epigraphic habit seems to be much more evenly distributed between cities and their hinterlands. And finally, just to mention the military. The military is often stated as a factor in the spread of Latin, and in lots of ways, it is a spreader of Latin. That is because, of course, when you're recruited into the army, if you're an auxiliary soldier, you know, you're probably coming into contact with Latin and literacy perhaps for the first time, and there are options for you to perhaps learn this to further your career. So it spreads Latin amongst the military men themselves, but it also, we see, spreads Latin to the recruiting areas. So they seem to write letters home. We can see that from Vindolanda. They go back to recruiting areas when they go on leave or whatever it is. And we can see, for example, in the Netherlands, that the Batavian region is quite more Latinate and more literate and more engaged in the epigraphic habit than surrounding non-recruiting areas. However, it is not the case that military installations in the provinces are necessarily kind of beacons of Latinization radiating out into the countryside, because it all depends on the nature of the communities around the military installations, to what extent they take up Latin. So, for example, in Wales and the hinterland of Hadrian's Wall, there are plenty of military installations, but it doesn't seem that literacy is taking off in those areas. So our main conclusions are really pushing the regional specificities that we're finding. But Mary Beard would say, so what? Why do we care? Well, we care because it tells us about life in a large part of the ancient world, and this is a good thing because we're classicists and we're interested in that. But it also is useful from a modern perspective, because it can feed into our conversations about our shared human past, about our cultural identities, about our regional histories. And perhaps for us, one of the most important things is that when we've gone into schools and we're talking about multilingualism, school children have said to us, wow, well, you know, this is the first time we've heard people talk about multilingualism in a really positive way. And that can be no bad thing. So I'd like to end with this slide so you can see how to get in contact with us if you'd like to find out more. Our website is a good place to go for publications and open access materials. And I'd also like to highlight this little picture here, which is a mold for making Samian ware. It's a, you know, so this would be a mold that you would create your nice shiny orange vessel with, because in the middle of it, sort of the middle animal seems to be a bear, and this allows me to seamlessly move on to Hannah O'Regan, who's going to be talking about box office bears. Thank you very much.